And I think for a proper introduction, though, I wanted to introduce Bonnie Kerness. Bonnie is a longtime AFSC staff person working in northern Jersey. She may be probably the most knowledgeable person on the issue of solitary confinement. I don't know where you put that on your resume exactly, but I think that's true, and she's had experience over probably 3 decades grappling with this concern throughout the country. So, with no further ado, and I'd like to introduce Bonnie Kerness.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Try and get this right. Everyone can hear? My early observations of oppression in this country began when I was 12. Watching television and seeing children of African descent, my own age, being hosed and bitten by dogs for trying to go to school. I watched it on a 10-inch television set. I spent 10 years in the civil rights movement in Tennessee, and when I came back north, I began working for the American Friends Service Committee, which is the social action arm of the Religious Society of Friends, which many of you may know. The Quakers, who have better than a 300-year history of commitment dealing with prison issues. I serve as a human rights advocate on behalf of men, women, and children in prisons throughout the United States, coordinating the Prison Watch Project for the AFSC in Newark. Many of the men, women, and children that I take testimony from call their imprisonment the war at home. From arrest to sentencing to conditions of confinement in prison, racial profiling is practiced. And the economic and political use of prisons is the law of the land. The politics of the criminal justice system, the police, the prison system, and the application of the death penalty are a manifestation of the racism, white supremacy, and classism that governs the lives of every one of us. Every aspect of the U.S. criminal justice system falls most heavily on the poor and people of color, including that slavery is mandated in prisons by the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States." While most of us don't give this amendment a second thought, it is at the core of how the labor of slaves was transformed and institutionalized into what people in prison call neo-slavery. African-descended, Latin, and Aboriginal young people have told us over the years that the presence of the police feels like an occupation army in their communities. They speak about school systems being used to feed young people of color into youth detention jails and prisons, where those bodies are suddenly worth a fortune. People have said to me that the criminal justice system doesn't work. I've come to believe exactly the opposite, that it works perfectly just as slavery did, as a matter of economic policy and a matter of political policy. How is it that a 15-year-old in Philadelphia, who the country labels worthless to the economy, who has no hope of getting a job or affording college, can suddenly generate $30,000 a year once trapped in the criminal justice system? The expansion of prisons, parole, probation, the court, and police systems has resulted in enormous bureaucracy, which has been a boon to everyone from architects to food vendors, all with one thing in common: a paycheck earned by keeping human beings in cages. The criminalization of poverty is a lucrative business, and we have replaced the social safety net with a dragnet. There is no contradiction in the fact that prisons are both hugely expensive and very profitable. Just like with military spending, the cost is public and the profits are private. Privatization in the prison industrial complex includes companies which run prisons for profit while at the same time profiting from forced labor. In New Jersey, food and medical services are provided by corporations with a profit motive. One explosion of private industry is the partnering of Corrections Corporation of America with the federal government to detain close to 1 million undocumented immigrants. Using public monies to enrich private citizens is the history of capitalism at its most exploitive. There are powerful economic and political interests in the business of punishment, which uses isolation as a form of torture. I want to share with you some of the voices that I hear during my day. I went in when I was 14. They have what they call an MCU in there, it's called Management Control Unit, and it's like the hole in a regular prison. Kids that fight go in there. If you refuse, they come and get you. You get a shower once a week and they bring food to you. I was cold all the time. This one was 12. I was 12 when they put me in isolation. I heard people scream. I saw boys get strung out on meds. They make you take sleeping stuff and needles. They used pepper spray on this girl who was fighting one time directly in her mouth and she couldn't breathe. They kept hitting her. We told them that she had asthma, but they wouldn't listen. The kids who testified to this were so frightened that they wouldn't use their names. The U.S. spends less than any other industrialized nation on nurturing its children. And in spite of dismal poverty rates, violent juvenile crime has been declining for years. Yet at least 43 states have passed laws making it easier for children to be tried as adults. We can't escape the similarities with chattel slavery here as well, because these are not white children. Not only are these mostly black and brown children taken from their families, they lose any chance for a future of their own choosing. The voices of adult prisoners are haunting as well. A social worker from Utah State Prison wrote, and Utah State Prison is full of the mentally ill. John was directed to leave the strip cell and a urine-soaked pillowcase was placed over his head like a hood. He was walked hooded and shackled to a different cell where he was placed in a device called the chair, and somewhere on the wall, Ojiri has a picture of the chair. He was kept in the chair for over 30 hours, being forced to urinate and defecate on his own hands, which were tucked underneath him. Women who contact the AFSC describe conditions of confinement, which include enduring sexual abuse by staff, with one woman saying, "That was not part of my sentence, to perform oral sex with officers." Another wrote, "The guards sprayed me with pepper spray because I wouldn't take my clothes off in front of 5 male guards. They carried me to an isolation cell, laid me down on the bed, and took my clothes off, leaving me with that pepper spray burning my face." Some of the most poignant letters we get at AFSC are from prisoners writing on behalf of the mentally ill, who cannot write often on behalf of themselves, like the man in California who had spread feces over his body. The guard's response to this was to put him in a bath so hot it boiled 30% of the skin off of him. There are entire isolation prisons housing the mentally ill, and the letters I get from these prisons are soul-shattering. "How do you describe desperation to someone who is not desperate?" began a letter to me from U.S. political prisoner Ojiri Lutulo. This was in 1986, who went on to depict everyone in the New Jersey State Prison Management Control Unit being awakened by guards dressed in riot gear at 1 o'clock every other morning. Once awakened, the prisoners were forced to strip, pack their belongings while feeling the dogs straining at their leashes, snapping at their private parts. He described being terrorized, intimidated, and the humiliation of being naked and not knowing whether the masked guards were male or female. If we think back to slavery and images of the civil rights movement, we understand that dogs have been used as a device of torture for hundreds of years in the United States. The thread that binds these testimonies is that they are from men, women, and children who are being held in isolation and who are experiencing conditions and devices of torture in human cages where there are very few witnesses. These past years have been full of complaints from prisoners and their families, describing inhumane conditions, including cold, filth, callous medical care, use of devices of torture, harassment, brutality, racism. I've received vivid descriptions and drawings of 4- and 5-point restraints, restraint hoods, restraint belts, restraint beds, stun grenades, stun guns, stun belts, spit hoods, tethers, waist and leg chains. Often the worst torment people testify to is the psychological assault of isolation or no-touch torture. Nothing else happens. There is no chemical abuse, there is no physical abuse. This can include humiliation, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, extreme light, extreme dark, extreme cold, extreme heat, extended solitary confinement, including other forms of intentional placement situations. They will pull someone in isolation from one cage and put them in another cage for no reason, sometimes with their belongings, often without their belongings. There's a picture of a bloody cage somewhere. Ojiri was placed in a cage that was dripping with blood. Someone had tried to commit suicide. This is a deliberate and systematic attack on all human stimuli. Prolonged solitary confinement, called control units, security threat group management units, special needs units, communications management units, every state has a different name, have been a long time concern for US activists, prison activists on both sides of the walls. It was during the tumultuous years of the civil rights era when, through the government's counterintelligence programs, large numbers of activists found themselves in US prisons. As 70s and 80s activists monitored what was happening in US prisons, we began to understand that not only was our generation marked because of our rebellion, but that the wider criminal justice system had become one of the largest businesses, and that it used solitary confinement as a method to neutralize radical political education on the streets and within the prisons. The history of isolation includes early use on Native leaders so that Aboriginal political resistance would be less likely. The use of long-term isolation to control political activism resurfaced during the movements of the 60s and 70s in the form of control units. I come from a generation which genuinely believed that each of us was free to dissent politically. In those years, people acted out that belief in a number of ways. Native youth contributed to the formation of the American Indian movement, dedicated to self-determination. Puerto Ricans joined the movement to free the island from US colonialism. Whites formed the Students for Democratic Society and anti-imperialists, while others worked in the Southern civil rights movements. This was the time when the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed, because children were and still are being shot in the streets. When there was a distinct rise in the prisoner rights movement, and when we saw on the evening news graphic pictures of the bullet holes fired by the Chicago police into Panther Fred Hampton's sleeping body, when young people protesting the Vietnam War died on Jackson and Kent State campuses, killed by the National Guard, when civil rights workers were killed with impunity, and a time when we felt that as if there was no opportunity to stop mourning because each day another activist was dead. These killings and other acts of oppression led to underground formations such as the Black Liberation Army. No threat was more alarming to this government than the Black Liberation Movement with its rejection of nonviolent civil disobedience. Sensory deprivation was used extensively with imprisoned members of these groups. In later years, we found jailhouse lawyers, Islamic militants, and prisoner activists placed in extended isolation. Ojiri was held in the Management Control Unit in New Jersey State Prison for 22 years because of his political beliefs. The collages that he created during those incomprehensibly long years are hanging around us today. efforts to expand the solitary confinement population involved the alleged spread of gang problems in the United States. In the 90s, AFSC began receiving letters from people in street organizations who were placed in units called Security Threat Group Management Units, complaining of extreme isolation, brutality, and racial profiling. It is the government, of course, which gets to define who a security threat group is. As example, okay,
Keep going.
I don't know what to
Keep going, keep going.
cut out. The progression of the use of isolation is most recently known as communications management units. The result of the government ordering special administrative measures during its ongoing war on terror. Everyone who is Islamic, who goes into the federal system, is placed in small group isolation in the communications management units. For those of us monitoring U.S. prisons over the decades, the targeting of radicalization, the targeting of specific groups, the surveillance and infiltration of these groups feels very familiar. This is what was done in the 70s and 80s, and it's being done now with Muslims. I think what is happening to Imam Jamil Al-Amin is a vivid example of this kind of profiling because of his long history of activism and his religion. In my era, he was known as Rap Brown, and he was an activist during the Civil Rights era who moved onward. The conditions and practices that the imprisoned testify to are in violation of the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Convention Against Torture, and many other conventions that the US has signed. We are victims of an ideology of inhumanity and white supremacy on which this country was built. If we dig deeper into the US criminal justice practices, the political function they serve is inescapable. The economic function is equally as chilling. Just as in the era of chattel slavery, there is a class of people dependent on bodies of color as a source of income. The Department of Corrections is more than a set of institutions, it's a state of mind. This is the state of mind that led to Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Guantanamo, and what is going on in US prisons at this moment. The AFSC has always recognized the existence and continued expansion of the penal system and the use of isolation as a spiritual crisis. It is a crisis which tries to silence dissent, one that allows children to be demonized. It is a crisis that legitimizes torture, isolation, and abuse of power. It is a crisis that extends beyond prisons into school and judicial systems. I know that each time we send a child to bed hungry, that is violence. That wealth concentrated in the hands of a few at the expense of many is violence. And that denial of dignity based on race, class, or sexual preference is violence. And that poverty and prisons are a form of state-manifested violence. For many of us, there are no former Jim Crow systems. The transition from slavery to black codes to convict leasing to Jim Crow laws to the wars on the poor, veterans, youth, and political activism has been a seamless evolution of political and social incapacitation of poor people of color. The sophisticated fascism of the practices of stop and frisk, charging people in inner cities with wandering, and there are kids in Newark who testify to this all the time. Walking while black, zip code racism, these and many other de facto practices all serve to keep our prisons full and our young men of color in danger. Trayvon Martin and those who have been killed since him joins a long list of young people who received the death penalty for being black. In a system where over 60% of those who are imprisoned are people of color, the concept of color blindness does not exist. The racism around me in my work is palpable every day in the testimony that comes in through the mail. I don't know. Gotta wrap up. I've been part of the struggle for civil and human rights for over 45 years. I've seen the horror that US government warlike policies wreak at home and abroad. My soul is haunted by what I read in my daily mail. We need to alter the very core of every system that slavery, racism, and poverty has given birth to, especially the criminal justice system. I cannot achieve contentment while so many of my fellow human beings are tortured in US prisons, nor can I have peace while this country continues its imperial outreach, waging war at home on the poor and people of color, and in the wider world, in Iraq, Afghanistan, the drone and low-intensity wars the US is waging in Pakistan, Yemen, the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Somalia, Colombia. For me, what I see in the military-industrial complex and what I see in the prison-industrial complex, those dots are strongly connected. Our work today needs to be embedded in the struggle against this system and its continued use of isolation and torture as a tool of behavior modification and political repression. An elder of my generation, George Jackson, and anybody who hasn't read him, I would suggest very strongly you go back and read him, said that there is no turning back from awareness. If I were to alter my step now, I would always hate myself. I would grow old feeling that I had failed in my obligatory duty that is ours once we become aware. Thank you.